and welcome to episode number 268 of Real Life Ghost Stories. And to kick things off this week, I would like to thank some of our newest Patreon subscribers. I would like to thank Janet Wheat, Jin FW, Miller B. Kepler, Melissa McKillis, Casey Unk, Yesinia Stevens, and Robin. Thank you so much for subscribing to the Patreon. I love you and appreciate you every single day. And our film review this week, our film review is Trap. Trap was released in 2024. It is 5.8 out of 10 on IMDb and 57% on Rotten Tomatoes. A father and teen daughter attend a pop concert where they realise they are at the centre of a dark and sinister event. Look, do you know, I'm always rooting for M. Night Shyamalan. Always. But I really wanted to like this. But I didn't. And he has let me down too many times, to be honest. And he just disappoints me. So, you know, M. Night, if you're listening, I'm not mad. I'm not angry. I'm just disappointed. You know, Signs. What a film. Sixth Sense. What a film. The Village. Loved it, to be honest. Great film. Split. That's one of his, isn't it? Unbreakable. Like, come on. They're great films. And then you end up with shite like this. And he's not pulling it out of the bag these days, right? And I'm finding that frustrating because I will always watch an M. Night Shyamalan film. Always. But now I think, why am I doing this to myself? I'm just constantly disappointed. Look, you know, in terms of likes, the concept was vaguely interesting, right? The FBI set up a sting operation at this pop concert to apprehend a serial killer. It's interesting, vaguely. The serial killer is Josh Hartnett. You learn that from the beginning. That's not a spoiler. It's pretty much in the trailer. And it was nice to see Josh Hartnett in a role like this. I feel like I haven't seen him in years. It was like seeing an old friend and being like, oh, hey, you're still around. And I also respected the fact, actually, that we knew what he was from the off. We knew he was the serial killer from the off. There was no attempt to hide. There was no like big twist. He's been the serial killer all along. We know that from the beginning. And I feel like that probably allowed him to settle into the role relatively well. A lot of people have been sort of like lauding his performance. He plays this dad, Cooper, who brings his daughter, and he is genuinely really devoted to his daughter. You can see that he really loves her, and he is keen to bring her to this concert because it's something that she loves. And it kind of gives a bit of three dimension to this idea of a serial killer. We often think about them as being, you know, loners, freaks, people who really stand out, but actually he's just a really good dad, and as far as we're aware, and is this big good looking man, a family man, bringing his daughter, doing his best, you know. And then you know that on the other side of it, he is also a serial killer who has this really horrible, dark side to him. But other than that, God, I wasn't really arsed about this film. Like, I just found it really boring. How could it possibly have been boring? The premise is that a serial killer is trapped in this concert and trying to figure a way out. Surely that implies it would be just absolutely brimming with tension, but there was no. I just didn't care. It was boring. It was long. I thought to myself, I don't care about any of these people. I just wanted it to be thrilling and intense, but it wasn't either of those things. And it also felt really stilted. I felt like the dialogue was stilted. I felt like the way the story moved was really stilted. And I don't know if it was just sort of poor acting or poor script writing, but the line delivery was really, a lot of it felt really hammy and like I am acting right now, so I'm delivering this line in a very particular way, which is not what you want to see. And I often talk about suspending disbelief when you're watching horror films, or even in this case thriller films. And I think it's important. You're watching a supernatural horror, you're watching a story about monsters, you're watching a story about vampires, ghosts, whatever it is. You suspend your disbelief, right? And things might happen in the plot that make you go, that doesn't feel like it would happen in real life. And you go, it's all right, it's a horror film, it's fine. But this film is rooted in reality. This is a film that is about the real world, the modern world, the world that we live in. And the need to suspend disbelief in this film is an understatement. That is the understatement of the century. Like it was ridiculous. The ridiculousness of it was just beyond all reason. There were so many things that I felt like that just wouldn't happen, or that character just wouldn't do that, or surely you just ring the police. But no, in order to drive this sort of stupid plot, we ended up in these situations that just didn't make any sense. And I don't want to give too much away about the story, but I just felt like the things that happened just wouldn't happen in real life. And therefore, you end up just going, well, this feels stupid, you know? And it really felt like this narrative completely relied on these improbable actions of these characters and improbable twists where you're like, this just feels stupid. And as it went on, I kind of thought, we're using a pop concert to try and trap this serial killer, but we don't know who this serial killer is. So we're gonna use an event that has literally tens of thousands of people at it to try and catch him. I don't know. I just feel like there's probably a better way, because that feels like it's inevitably going to be busy, chaotic, messy. Not the easiest way to find an individual man when you don't know what you're actually looking for. And even though I said that, you know, Josh Hartnett did well with what he was given, I thought he did do well with what he was given, I also felt like there wasn't very much nuance to his character, right? And people are going to be like, what do you mean? He was his family man and a serial killer. But those seemed to be the only two shades of his character. It was like, you know, charming, lovely family man, and then, haha, I've actually been a serial killer this whole time. There was nothing else. There was no other aspects to him. I wasn't drawn in by him. You never saw him get flustered. You never saw him lose control. I just sort of felt like that's also not realistic, and it's a very narrow view of psychopaths or sociopaths, you know? And as well as that, the other character, I just didn't care about any of the other characters. There was no development in any of the other characters. They were just sort of there to drive the plot. And I have to say this, right? So the story centres around this pop concert by a pop star called Lady Raven is her name. And I became increasingly annoyed that this pop star in question was M. Night Shyamalan's daughter in real life, right? I didn't think she was very good. And it genuinely felt like this weird vanity project where he put her into this role where she's this absolutely adored pop star who is, you know, selling out arenas, who is admittedly fine, but not great. But then she somehow inexplicably becomes the hero of the piece. And she makes these decisions where I'm like, babe, this isn't going to make you a hero. This is going to make you dead. You know? And she's not very good. And a lot of the stuff that happens with her is actively ridiculous in terms of improbability. I don't know. The cynical part of me felt like this was built around her. This whole film was created so she could have this role as a pop star that saves the day. You know, wasn't great. And I watched Signs last week. Oh man, what a film that is. It's still so good. It is so well written. I loved the characters. I'm invested in the family. You know, the peril is real. It's terrifying. It's so terrifying. The story all links together beautifully. You're asking big questions by the end of it. M. Night, go back to that. Stop churning out this shit. I'm giving it 2 stars. Was it good? No, but was it nice to see Josh Hartnett back in action? Yeah, it was. So 2 stars for Trap.
Instacart is on a mission to have you not leave the couch this basketball season. Because between the pregame rituals and the postgame interviews, it can be difficult to find time for everything else. So let Instacart take care of your game day snacks or weekly restocks and get delivery in as fast as 30 minutes. Because we hear it's bad luck to be hungry on game day. So download the Instacart app today and enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 orders. Service fees apply for 3 orders in 14 days, excludes restaurants.
Which brings us to our story this week. Now, our story this week is all about the Eloise Lunatic Asylum. Now, I try and space these asylum stories out as much as possible because they are often very similar. And before we start, I think it's important to point out that lunatic asylum was the term that was used in that period of time, okay? I'm not using it in a derogatory way. I am very aware that it is not an appropriate term now, but I'm using it because that is the term that was used at the time. That is what the building would have been known as, and there are terms and ways that people were treated within this story that are not remotely appropriate by today's standards, right? So I just got to cover that before we start. I am aware, not doing it to be derogatory, this is the language that was used at the time. We are going to crack into this story. Let's go. The year is 1832. The planet hasn't yet been ravaged by 2 world wars. A big boom of industry and technology is just on the horizon. But first, America would have to survive great hardships like the Great Depression. Cars, prohibition, the Spanish influenza, all of that was in the future. And for now, America was still at war, taming its own wilderness across huge swathes of its land. Believe it or not, but a patch of land only 2 miles outside the city limits of Detroit was just one of those brushes of untamed wilderness. It wasn't exactly a barren desert or even overrun with wild and dangerous animals, but it was somewhat in the middle of nowhere. That was why the city of Detroit built the Wayne County poorhouse there, safely tucked away out of sight and far from the general population of Detroit. And out in the wilderness, the poorhouse could serve many purposes. First was rather an obvious one, a place for the city of Detroit to house its most poor and destitute people. Orphans found a makeshift home, and were sometimes even given new families under the ramshackle roof of the poorhouse. Other, more unfortunate children and adults alike would die there from disease or malnutrition. But some people also found work, and there was the second purpose to the poorhouse and its strategic location. This was the time of horses and carriages. Stagecoaches were about the only way to get from one place to another, and they didn't exactly travel as quickly as the modern day car. This was back when it took 2 days by stagecoach to get from Hamtramck in Detroit to Nankin, even though when you look on a map, those 2 townships couldn't seem closer. So what that meant for the Wayne County poorhouse out on the rural roads of Michigan is that they could offer a place at their meagre fare to people on the road. The poorhouse then opened the Black Horse Tavern that functioned both as a pit stop to break up the journey and also a stagecoach stop for people travelling between Detroit and Chicago. In theory, the Black Horse Tavern was a good gig and had the potential to provide a stable income for anyone unfortunate enough to find themselves sent out there to live. But only 2 years later, and the Black Horse Tavern and the poorhouse attached to it were in terrible condition. To combat that, the county reinvested in the poorhouse and turned it into a fully fledged hospital. Well, by hospital I mean asylum. And in those days you didn't have to be mentally ill to be sent to a mental institution. You just had to be poor. But nevertheless, the Eloise Psychiatric Hospital, named after the then Detroit postmaster's daughter, officially opened its doors. They only had 35 patients, or inmates as they were called in those days, and for the meantime 35 was all they were going to get. An estimated 111 potential inmates had refused to be housed at the new hospital because of its wild and remote location. But the 35 patients who did agree to go would see many changes to the institution over the following years. The log cabin that had once been the Black Horse Tavern was first transformed into a keeper's cabin for the hospital employees, then became a brand new building to house the patients. On a side note, I'll keep calling them patients because that's what they would be in our time. But I think the fact that they were actually called inmates in their own time paints a more accurate picture of what these people went through and how they were treated. Anyway, I don't really want to get into that bit just yet, but I feel like it would be better to set the tone for everything that's going to come later. If we go into it remembering that they were not actually considered patients. These people weren't free, and they couldn't just leave whenever they felt like it. As soon as they were admitted into the hospital, they essentially lost all of their basic human rights. But again, I'm going to circle back around to that. So for now, back to the physical changes at Eloise. The employees first got a cabin to live in. Then the patients got a new place for them, and then they all got a brand new cooking cabin to prepare the food for everyone who lived on the hospital grounds. And so Eloise Psychiatric Hospital continued to grow. From those original 35 patients sprouted 10,000. To look after that astronomical number of people and to take care of the now sprawling 78 buildings over 902 acres of land, the hospital would then need over 2,000 employees. This would make Eloise the largest psychiatric facility in the United States, and it was entirely self-sufficient. It had its own police, its own fire department, it had a railroad and a trolley system to help cart goods from one end of the facility to the other. It had its own bakery, entertainment hall, laundromat, post office and a power plant. And to feed the over 12,000 people living there, Eloise had its own farm too. Well, by farm I mean a farm for growing food. Its own herd of cows for milking and its own herd of pigs. It had greenhouses, a root cellar, and even a shed for curing tobacco, because times were just different back then. By the time of the Great Depression, when all you had to do was be poor to be sent to an insane asylum, taking care of the mentally ill was a booming industry. And as it always goes when business is booming, it is the most vulnerable people amongst us who usually pay the price. Patients were essentially guinea pigs. Some good of all of the experiments and developments in technology did come from the huge success of Eloise Psychiatric Hospital. They were one of the only facilities around where someone could get an X-ray in Detroit, and it was the first hospital to have a kidney dialysis machine in the entire state of Michigan. But again, there is always a price, and it was the inmates who paid it. Some of them benefited from the less invasive forms of treatment like music and art therapy. But others found themselves the unwilling participants in treatments like hydrotherapy and shock therapy, where they would be electrocuted until they were essentially subdued. And remember, a lot of people in the facility, especially during the times of the Great Depression, they weren't actually mentally ill, they were just poor. Not only that, but it was also very easy to suddenly find yourself involuntarily being admitted into a facility just like Eloise. For a woman, all she had to do was be unfaithful to her husband. For either gender, all they had to do was be caught masturbating. If these people who didn't actually suffer from any kind of mental illness managed to make it out of their stay at Eloise Psychiatric Hospital without being subjected to terrifying and painful forms of therapy, they still would have to spend their time there constantly looking over their shoulders. There was no separation between patients who were there because they were poor or because they'd cheated on their husbands and those who were suffering from serious and debilitating conditions. Nowhere was safe. A patient in for a mental illness that had driven them to assault and violence would be sat down right next to one whose only complaint was that they couldn't afford to feed themselves. And as if that wasn't enough, the infamous lobotomy was about to burst onto the psychiatric scene. Some patients would then be subjected to a form of treatment that had doctors removing parts of their brain, and the results were mixed at best. Some patients responded well to a lobotomy. Some ended up taking their own lives afterwards. Despite what the happy holiday pictures of the staff and the ones with piles of vegetables straight from the farms to the table would have you believe, many of the patients at Eloise Psychiatric Hospital lived in constant fear. Fear that seems to have lingered long after the facility closed its doors. Witnesses have reported seeing a hat man, a type of spirit known to haunt places and sites that were once places of great fear. They are often seen wearing a trench coat and a hat, usually something like a fedora. But unlike most spirits, it's believed that these hat men are not the remnants of something that had once been alive. Whatever they are, they seemed to congregate in these dark blots in human history, lingering in corners and silently watching. A woman now working at what remains of the Eloise Psychiatric Hospital claims to have seen one, and believes that the man that she often sees around the grounds has been drawn there by the fear that the patients once felt behind its doors. "I don't think he has a name, to be honest," she said. "Hat men are not typically known spirits that were once living." The woman who claims to have seen this hat man is far from the first to do so, and she is also far from the last person to have experienced paranormal activity on the grounds of Eloise either. Many have been there when doors slam all on their own, when medical carts and tables suddenly go flying across the room or flip over. Others have seen dark shadows dripping down from the ceilings and oozing out of the walls. These shadows sometimes seem human-like. Sometimes they come with voices that moan or whisper or even scream. Some of them seem to have evil intentions. Another staff member at the facility has nicknamed him the Creeper. She claims to have run into him while she was working in the basement, and says that the whole ordeal felt like it lasted for 20 minutes when it was actually probably only 20 seconds. She also can't be sure that it's the same one, but she claimed that she could feel something stalking her, and some of the other employees through the facility after this encounter as well. And it would turn out that the basement was a hotspot for paranormal activity. It had actually been flooded and inaccessible for decades, but work on the building meant that it needed to be drained. After that, the paranormal investigators swooped in to see if they could find any answers as to why things at the Eloise Psychiatric Hospital kept going bump in the night. Down there was very eerie, Jeff Adkins, co-founder of Detroit Paranormal Expeditions, later said. "You sense someone else is down there, even though you are by yourself. It was one of the most eerily quiet places I have ever been." Jeff also said that while he was down there, he could hear the constant sound of water dripping, even though the basement had already been drained and was now dry. And he could also sometimes hear footsteps coming from other parts of the basement, even though he was down there alone. Perhaps it was the Creeper making its presence known, or perhaps it was one of the children that others have seen on the grounds. Many people believe that the pair of children often spotted running around the corridors and playing actually lived at Eloise back when it was a simple poorhouse. Chances are that the two spirits, who seem happy enough and disappear as soon as they turn a corner, were some of the unfortunate orphans who never found a new family and died of disease or malnutrition behind the Black Horse Tavern. And it seems like many former inhabitants of the Eloise Psychiatric Hospital have found it difficult to move on after their deaths. One woman is said to appear as a white vapour, shapeless and translucent. She has a seemingly simple request to anyone who will listen. "Help me," she whispers. But the truth is, no one has been able to find out what happened to her. Perhaps she was one of the victims of one of the doctors, said to still walk the halls. Seen in his white jacket, this doctor prowls looking for more patients to treat with his diabolical forms of therapy. Maybe he's after the patient, sometimes seen drenched and dripping water behind them like they've just come back from the baths of hydrotherapy. Maybe he's after the patient, sometimes seen in a bloodied smock, looking like they've just come back from having a lobotomy. Or maybe it's one of the many residents of Potter's Field that he's after. That is a mystery that president of the Westland Historic Village, Ryan Eberhardt, is still trying to solve to this day. During the course of an interview, he pointed to a few books on his shelf. "This ledger and this ledger over here," he said, "are one of, I believe, 5 that tell all the deaths from 1926 to 1948. That's almost 20 years worth of deaths. But even with that taken into consideration, the number of people buried at Potter's Field, just beside Eloise, is staggering. There are over 7,100 burials on that site, all of them in nameless graves, and the stone markings used to differentiate between lots have been overgrown and moved by vegetation. It is near impossible to tell which grave belongs to which person, especially because multiple people were buried on top of each other to save space and land. Most of these people had no next of kins. They were poor, probably mistreated, and even in death they were afforded no dignity. But Ryan Eberhardt is doing his best to bring some closure to as many of them as he can. I would say that less than 1% have been identified," he said. "Part of the reason I don't think a lot of them will ever be identified is a lot are John and Jane Does in this field, because this was a general hospital. There were people who were victims of a crime that were never identified, so we'll never know who that person is. For the nameless people in Potter's Field and the thousands of people who would walk through the halls of the Eloise Psychiatric Hospital, time was slowly but surely running out. Over the next 40 years, the number of patients and staff at the facility began to dwindle. By 1958, there was no more need for the farm and the dairy herd, and by 1972, some of the largest buildings on the grounds had been completely abandoned. By 1977, they'd started closing down the psychiatric programs. By 1982, the state had completely taken over operations and had closed everything down by 1986. Eloise has now been turned into a strip mall, golf course and condominiums. There is a small portion that is still used for psychiatric patients and another portion that functions as a family shelter, but most of it is open to the public in some way or another. You could even visit some of the attractions and see if you'd be one of the ones lucky enough to lay your eyes on one of the infamous spirits of the Eloise Psychiatric Hospital. John Hambrick, who actually bought the property back in 2018, said that the first thing that happened afterwards was all of the fire alarms in the building suddenly went off. Shortly after that, he found a light flickering on one of the upper floors that had been sealed off for decades. I realised that this was the holy grail of paranormal activity, he said. The manager at this property said that being at Eloise makes you feel like you're stepping back in time. And maybe in a way you are. Or maybe it's more like Eloise is just one of those places that has slipped through what science can explain with its perception of time and space. And the doors of what remains of the Eloise Psychiatric Hospital now open up to a different world entirely. This story got me to thinking, right, about, and I think I've spoken about this in the podcast before, there is that really famous meme that goes around, which is a document that shows the reasons why patients were admitted into insane asylums back in the 1800s, right? And I'm reading this from Snopes because this comes up quite regularly. And it first came out, right, this image in February 2016. And it's said to be a list of reasons as to why people were admitted into insane asylums between 1864 and 1889, right? And you now we look at it and we go, my God, like I'd be in there in a heartbeat. So reasons for admission, I'm going to give you some good ones, some of the absolute the key players here. We've got imaginary female trouble. We've got ill treatment by husband. We have just a general immoral life, jealousy, laziness, marriage of son, masturbation for 30 years, masturbation and syphilis, menstrual deranged, ladies, we've all been there, periodical fits, tobacco and masturbation, political excitement, politics in general, religious enthusiasm, fever and loss of lawsuit, fits and desertion of husband. We have bad whiskey, business nerves, death of sons in war. We also have deranged masturbation, We have excitement as officer, exposure and quackery, the war, time of life, uterine derangement, vicious vices, which is also quite difficult to say, women trouble. And I mean, we've all been there before too. Spinal irritation, gathering in the head, greediness, grief, gunshot wound, hard study, novel reading. Like there's a lot, female disease just in general. So, right, we've all seen that. And obviously I mentioned the masturbation one in the body of the story. It's kind of, this is sort of one of those things that is essentially, it is rooted in truth, but it's not the reason why people were admitted into lunatic asylums at the time. So it wasn't a case of, oh, this person was reading a novel, so we're having them committed, we're having them put into a lunatic asylum. Basically, the thinking was that this list was reasons why people might have then gone on to become mentally unwell. So, for example, and it makes sense when you think about it, the war, that could be PTSD, right before PTSD was widely recognised as a mental health condition. So, you say grief. So they're not put into hospital because of grief, but grief has caused them to develop a mental illness. So you have smallpox. They weren't put into the hospital because they had smallpox. They were put into the asylum because smallpox has altered their mental health in some way. And I think that's an important distinction to make. So masturbation and syphilis, we know that syphilis is a degenerative disease that absolutely targets your brain function. So they weren't put into the hospital because they were masturbating. It was just thought that perhaps masturbating might have been the cause of some of their later mental health symptoms. I think that's a really interesting thing, because of course it is easy to look at something like they were abused, ill treatment by their husband, and then they were put into an asylum for it. And you're thinking, hang on a second, they were mistreated by their husband, so they were locked away in an asylum. What sense does that make? Actually, it's thought that the ill treatment by the husband caused later mental health issues, right? And that's why they ended up being sent to an asylum. Now, of course, there are huge amounts of incidents where people were wrongly admitted into asylums, and the reason being that maybe somebody in their family just wanted to get rid of them. So they found lots of reasons to be able to commit people into asylums when they should not have been in there. And it kind of makes sense, when you're in an era where people don't really understand mental health issues, and they're kind of flailing around trying to find reasons as to why somebody may be behaving in this way. Now, obviously we know in the modern world that there are, chemical imbalances that cause mental health difficulties, as well as traumatic incidents, childhood issues, etc. Right? We know that now. But back then they're thinking, why is this person suddenly behaving like this? Well, we need to figure out something that they have been doing that has caused them to behave like this. So it kind of makes sense. It doesn't make it any better, but it does kind of make sense. And you can see why I try and space out these stories of lunatic asylums, because they're all the same. It's all the same story. A place is opened up, it becomes too big too quickly. People get put in there who shouldn't be put in there. You've got poor people who are just mixing in with people who have serious mental health issues. It's dangerous. People are not treated well. Oh, suddenly they think we can use these patients to experiment on with different therapies. So people end up having shock therapy, hydrotherapy, lobotomies. None of it's good. None of it's good. And you'd like to think that for the most part, the people who worked in these facilities worked there and were really trying to do their best for the people that lived there. That is what you have to hold on to for the most part, But it's inevitable that these places are going to be filled with big energy. And I think of all places that could be haunted, I feel like old lunatic asylums are the place that I would be first place I'd go if I was trying to prove that ghosts are real, or that hauntings are real, or that residual energy exists. Because they are just places that were full of trauma, fear, that were full of violence, aggression, sadness, all of that negative emotion just being absorbed by those buildings all the time. And I do think it's an interesting phenomenon that if a place, if a building is physically removed from society, so in the case of the Eloise Psychiatric Hospital, it was out in the middle of nowhere. That building develops its own way of functioning as a society. That place becomes its own environment that is separate from the rest of civilization, and things happen in places like that where, awful things happen. Abuse thrives in environments like that. So you best believe there were other dark, evil things happening in that place. Like 100%. And I also think it's so interesting that at one point there was a tavern there, the Black Horse Tavern, which was obviously a stagecoach stop en route, between Detroit and Chicago. You attach that to a poor house where there are poor, vulnerable people. You're out in the middle of nowhere. You stop your stagecoach. You're not a particularly good person. You can do stuff and get away with it and then be off on the road, never seen again. Listen, I would imagine lots of terrible stuff. I don't even want to think too much about it because it gives me the heebie-jeebies. However, what I will say is that the Hat Man needs to give it a rest. I say this all the time, And I think that if there ever was dark entities, right? If dark entities exist in this world in any shape or form, this is the type of place they would be attracted to. Imagine the energy. It's like sharks when they smell blood particles in the water. They smell the blood particles, they appear from miles around in order to feed off whatever it is that's sick and injured. That's what this feels like for me. And that's how you end up with entities like the Hat Man, feeding off that dark energy. There must be enough dark energy in a place like that to just gorge yourself on for the rest of eternity. And I think one of the things that really breaks my heart about these stories is when you have the ghosts of children, like these little orphans who had nowhere else to go, just sent to this big terrifying place. It doesn't even bear thinking about. And then to still be there all that time later. This is the time when I hope it's just residual energy, that stone tape theory is real, and that it's just playing back significant moments at significant times, and that's why we see those ghosts of children knocking around in these places. I hate to think that that the soul of these children or the spirit of these children is stuck there replaying this. This is where you hope stone tape theory is a big old thing. I would love to know about the people who currently live in the facility. I suppose that's the best way to call it. It's got a strip mall, it's got a golf course, it's got condos, and obviously still has a small psychiatric unit. The people in those condos, they must experience something. They must experience stuff there. For sure. Like, they just have to. My friend used to live in the grounds of an old psychiatric hospital, and she lived in what was the water tower, I suppose. And she often experienced weird little paranormal things like flashing lights and stuff moving around. And I just think it's kind of like, it feels a bit inevitable. It's like I say, of all places that are going to be haunted, it's going to be an old school lunatic asylum. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. And if you would like to send in your story, you can do so by emailing it to reallifeghoststoriespodcast@gmail.com. You can also check out the website, reallifeghoststoriespodcast.com. And if you are desperate for some extra content, you can subscribe to the Patreon. That is patreon.com/reallifeghoststories, where for $5 a month or $2 a month, you get access to heaps of extra content, as well as every single main and mini episode completely ad-free. And on that note, I shall see you next time.
For 25 years, Brightview Senior Living Associates have been committed to creating a vibrant culture and delivering exceptional services, making Brightview a great place to work and live. If you're looking for a rewarding opportunity to serve your local community and grow, we want you to join our team. Brightview Senior Living is growing and actively seeking vibrant associates to join our community teams, including directors, healthcare, activities, hospitality, and dining. Apply today at careers.brightviewseniorliving.com. Equal employment opportunities. Text BV Jobs to 97211 to apply.